Hey, Jonah.
Hi, David. How's it going?
Good. Now, we are here, as often with these things, the miracle of modern technology, we're able to speak halfway across the world, but I think you and I are about 4 blocks away from each other.
I think that's about right, yeah.
Anyway, we're taking up a conversation here to follow on a blog post you did at NRO that sort of issued a half invitation, half challenge to me. And so I'm ready to discuss it with you, even though we're near neighbors. We don't talk as often as we should. So let's go.
Okay. If you want me to restate the original provocation, I'd be glad to.
All right.
I'm glad to stay out of some of the other more recent contretemps. Basically, while I disagree with a lot of either the stylistic or the policy positions that you sort of either have embraced or seem to have embraced, I don't really have a problem with conservatives or people generally, but since we're talking about conservatism generally, we'll just talk about conservatives. I don't have a problem with conservatives or public intellectuals getting out of ahead of trends that they see are out there. I don't mind them. One of the things I love about the conservative movement is that it has been the home of 50 years of great internecine squabbles and dogmatic fights about first principles, and it's always seemed to me to be the health of it. I encourage that, and I have no problem with it. What I have a problem with is the way it seems to me from watching from not too afar, you've gone about doing it. There is a certain, as I think I put it in the post, tone deafness to the approach in where there are a lot of, I would say, invidious statements about your fellow conservatives. You have these formulations where you talk about conservatives of a modern mind or modern-minded conservatives versus presumably the rest of us. The battles you've picked in terms of lighting into Rush Limbaugh and talk radio and Fox News and more recently, and I think pretty unfoundedly, National Review, I don't get it. Because if your intent is to persuade conservatives to revisit their thinking, it doesn't seem to me to be the right way to go about it. If your intent is to, as you said before, win over younger voters, win over Hispanics, win over the highly educated sort of college students and all the rest, the Jon Stewart crowd and all the rest, it also doesn't seem to me all that wise to be going around saying that, and I'm speaking with a broad brush here, that the Republican Party is captive to a bunch of essentially mule-headed, doctrinaire, talk radio blowhards who are making their cases solely out of a sort of almost Marxist self-interest, rather than any desire to change America and all the rest. It seems to me that you're not going to win over those guys to the Republican Party by describing the Republican Party in those ways, and you are going to burn bridges rather than open them up between a lot of conservatives and Republicans who might be receptive to some of your policy positions, precisely because the way you've gone about it strikes so many as sort of invidious towards people who probably agree with you on most issues. And lastly, as I said in the post, I understand, and if I was describing your position incorrectly, I'm definitely open to correction, that it seems to me that you are making essentially a gamble that, or a prediction, that the American polity is going to have to move in the same direction that Britain and Canada and other nations have towards making peace with a sort of more robust, progressive society, a welfare state society, and all of the rest, more, to use a non-pejorative term, more inclusive and cosmopolitan society. And therefore, since it happened in those places, it's going to happen here, and we might as well get ahead of the curve. And I guess lastly, you're not so much the focal point of this, but you're sort of the dashboard saint for a lot of these people making these, what I now believe to be almost entirely silly arguments about epistemic closure and whatnot. and the idea that the conservative movement is bereft of intellectuals doing serious intellectual work. And I don't think that that is the sort of argument that either helps your cause, helps the country, or helps conservatism when you lend aid and comfort to it. I think that sort of covers the bases. May come up with some others, but I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, that's a good statement, I think. I think you very cogently summed up the way probably a lot of people on the right think. One thing you said that I was surprised and heartened by was to hear that there are a lot of people who agree with my policy positions. That's
who may or may not. You know, I mean,
Okay.
I think on a lot of conservative positions, you're actually probably still pretty conservative. You've downplayed some of them, and on some I now have question marks about, but I don't think that you're that far from what I can tell, you know, with the exception of some specifics. On the bulk of them, you know, it's sort of the old Reaganite proposition that if you agree with me on 7 out of 10 things, you're a conservative, and my guess is that you agree with maybe not how they sell the ideas, but in sort of basic conservative principles and propositions, you're, you know, in the 7 out of 10 range, I would bet. Maybe I'm wrong.
Maybe
you tell me.
Probably higher, but let me think about a good way into this, and maybe start with sort of a personal statement of how I find myself where I am. I had the experience of serving in the Bush administration, not in a very important capacity, obviously, but I had a good view. And I came out of that and had to brood very hard about what had happened and what had seen. Most of my work was, of course, in the domestic policy area, and that was, to put it mildly, not an area of dramatic success. And I think there are a lot of things about that experience that troubled me, but one of the most important was at the top of the cycle of economic expansion from 2001 to 2007, the average American family was worse off than they were slightly worse off, adjusting for inflation, than they were at the top of the previous expansion. And that seemed to me to be a warning that Republicans couldn't win the 2008 election, and that was even before Lehman Brothers. If the Republicans lost, that would put at risk the entire Bush foreign policy, the strong national defense, which is a big part of my conservative thinking, and the failure of the domestic policy of the Bush years had huge consequences for America's role in the world, which is something that is a very high priority of mine. And I began to think about that very hard. Why had things gone so wrong? And I came up with some answers. But in half a dozen years of talking about this with conservatives going around the country, what I was struck by was, although I'm heartened by what you say, that it didn't seem to be a true description of the way conservatives were thinking. That wherever you went, you discovered people dug into positions like tax cuts always increase revenues to the government. Dug into positions like the American healthcare system is a tremendous success, the best system in the world. That there is that the United States does not have a long-run fiscal problem. That this policy solutions that were drafted in the 1970s, that those not only defined policy answers, that those were fundamental questions of principle. That tax cuts were a principle, school vouchers were a principle, and that these things, and that when you questioned these policy answers, that you were actually questioning important conservative principles. And I became very worried, unlike you, about the inventory of conservative governance. How are we going to be able to govern successfully ever again in the future? And it seems to me that when you lean on that you discover, contrary to what you said, that the House of Conservatism is not really so solid. And that seemed to me to be something that was worth talking about. Now, when you start to talk about that, what you discover is that the network of talk radio stations and Fox News and other modes of popular communication that were once adjuncts to the conservative world have a tremendously powerful effect on constraining what political leaders do, what intellectuals do, what they feel they can say. And that well before I got into this game, what you saw was whenever any conservative politician or Republican politician got into a tangle with any of these spokesmen, that person would have to back down, would have to apologize, that they really were the ones in charge. And that strikes me as a very serious problem. And it came to a head during this healthcare debate, where Republicans dug themselves into positions that I think it was knowable in advance were untenable. They missed opportunities to make deals that it was visible were there. And that we have now ended up in a situation where, in an attempt to get a huge political victory, that Republicans did not operate effectively. And we've now got a huge new social program, financed in ways that are very destructive, that it's going to be incredibly difficult to change. That Obamacare is going to be a very large factor in all of our lives. And it seems to me that somebody ought to say something about all of that. And I'm sorry that if conservatives don't find it persuasive the way I said it, but I've tried saying it in a lot of different ways over a lot of different years, and it wasn't persuasive then either. Maybe that's my fault.
Well, I mean, there's a lot like the claim that conservatives need some new ideas, I don't think is necessarily wrong. My problem with it is that with the way you've come across in presenting it, is that somehow the conservative infrastructure of think tanks and magazines and the intellectual firmament of conservatism has ceased to be at work at that, and I don't find it. I mean, I simply don't find it persuasive.
Okay.
I mean,
so supposing President Mitt Romney or President Tim Pawlenty takes office in January of 2015, they're going to confront a series of problems having to do with the bad finances of the United States, the deteriorating human capital of the United States, environmental problems. What will they do? What will they do? What would, for example, let's look at the healthcare part. What would a President Romney or President Pawlenty do about that? And what would they be allowed to do? All through the healthcare debate, that we kept hearing, there were, I think, 4 or 5 Republican talking points about solutions, and they were to sell insurance across state lines. They were to deal with lawsuits. I forget what the others were, but they were that kind of thing. I mean, I think there were not more than 4, and it just, I mean, to everyone who cared about the subject, they just seemed, not bad ideas, not wrong ideas exactly, but unresponsive, inadequate, and ideas that were generated more for the sake of having something to say than a coherent response. And the test of that was, of course, that there had been this huge era of Republican dominance, culminating in a Republican president, Senate, and House all at the same time in 2001 to 2007. And nothing was done in those years about any of these problems. Now, that strikes me as an indication of an inventory that is quite bare.
Well, look, I mean, we're sort of coming into the movie halfway here. I mean, for starters, I was not a fan of the Bush domestic agenda from the beginning. I mean, from the first time I heard the phrase compassionate conservatism I didn't like it. Now, there were a lot of people, some of my colleagues, who may not have liked the phrasing, but they thought something like that was necessary for some of the reasons that you're getting at. But it seems to me that when the Bush administration, the administration that you were part of, was going after, was transforming Medicare Part D, or creating Medicare Part D, right, the prescription drug benefit, when it was doing the faith-based initiative stuff and all of these sorts of things, when it was federalizing education, which at one point had been one of the bedrock principles of conservatism, was not to federalize education. It seems to me that much of the Republican Party and much of the conservative movement followed right along. I mean, National Review had problems with a lot of it, and I think that the criticisms of National Review that said it was too much of a cheerleader of President Bush, they get, there's some merit to those claims, but at the same time, National Review was also criticizing the formation of DHS. It had a real problem with the prescription drug benefit. It had a real problem with the faith-based initiative stuff. And so it seems to me that there's a contradiction here where you're saying, where all of a sudden you had a Republican president and Republican administration that was, in effect, reinventing conservatism. And the supposedly monolithic, locked-in, knee-jerk conservative movement that is not open to new ideas was actually quite open to a lot of new ideas from the Bush administration. Now, whether or not they were good new ideas or not, I think we could probably find some common ground. But they were new ideas. They were, George Bush came into office saying he's a different kind of conservative. He's a compassionate conservatism. He said in interviews that he disagreed fundamentally with Buckleyite conservatism, saying that conservatism should no longer just stand athwart history yelling stop. It should be activist and, strong government conservatism, big government conservatism. There were lots of pieces by people that both of us respect that were rushing to Bush's defense on these things. So it seems to me that you can't quite claim that the Republican Party and the conservative movement are so locked into these.
That's not my claim.
Well, if they're not,
it's not my claim that there is no. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Sure.
Because you were about to say maybe go something different than I thought you were about to say, and so I apologize.
It's okay. Look, my only point is if your point is that over the last decade or so, the Republican Party has been stuck in, as you laid out in your initial statement, has been stuck in these sort of frozen in amber 1970s and 1980s policy prescriptions about tax cuts, about the size of government, about the role of government, and all of the rest. There should have been a lot more protest about what the Bush administration was doing than there actually was. And so, while I think, you had this piece the other day about Woodrow Wilson, which I think we can get to, which I think is completely wrong. But I do think you're right, and I've written about this a couple times myself, that there is this sort of delayed backlash, this reaction against Bush, that there was a sense that we were sold a bill of goods. And so, since we screwed up when we were in power, when we were modernizing or adapting and all of the rest, maybe what we need to do now that we're completely out of power is to go back to first principles, which I don't think is necessarily a bad reaction. So just the intellectual climate at the sort of the top end among the, let's call them the intellectual conservatives, plus the malleability of the rank and file of the Republican Party is really is not really recognizable from the way you describe it to me.
Well, let me give you a short history of what I think happened. That this back to basics move has occurred often. Mm-hmm. We had it in 1964 when conservatives were fed up with the compromises of the Eisenhower years. We saw it again in the late 1970s. We saw it again in 1994. And it always disappoints. It always, because the fact is that not only is the country accepting of a welfare state that consumes between a fifth and a quarter of actually more, that's the federal portion. The whole thing costs about a third of national income on its way to 40%. But so are the Republican voters, as we saw in the town halls last summer, where the Republican Party committed itself to an unflinching defense of Medicare as it is, in fact suggested that any attempt to reduce the generosity of Medicare was tantamount to murdering grandma. The party keeps bumping up against that reality. And so these back to basic moments lead to sort of sobering up moments. And we had that between that's the story of how George Bush became the Republican nominee and how he became president. That in 1998, Republicans had a disastrous election. They'd had a bad election in 1996. And although Newt Gingrich hails the government shutdown as a great victory, in fact, a lot of the problems trace back to that moment. In 1998, there was one Republican, however, who had done outstandingly well. George Bush. He got almost 70% of the vote in Texas and did well with African Americans and Hispanics and women. And the party said, okay, we have to follow this guy. And where I think the President Bush was right was he had the right diagnosis of what had happened in the late 1990s. And that what the Republicans had tried to do in 1994, 95, 96 had not worked and wasn't going to work. Now he didn't have a good remedy, but he had the right description. He then came into office and did all the things you say, and a lot of them were kind of disappointing. Some of them may stand the test of time a little bit better than others. And the result, we went through the 2008 experience, and now we are again having a back to basics moment, and probably the most intense back to basics moment since the middle 1960s, since the Goldwater years. It's going to, and the cycle is going to repeat itself. I think this time what is different is it is true that the media, popular conservative communication, are so incredibly powerful, and they really do define the limits not only of what Republican politicians can say, but of what a lot of thinkers feel they can say, at least publicly. And you have a party that now finds itself trapped in it can't deal with the country's fiscal problems, a party and a movement that can't deal with the country's fiscal problems in a real way, that is constrained in all kinds of other ways by having to go along with a lot of propositions that, I mean, do you think President Obama is a Marxist?
No.
Okay. And yet that is something we hear on radio and television all the time. And a lot of the people who we rely on to support Republican candidates are absolutely sold on that proposition. It's absolutely sold on it. And of course that makes it, if the president is a Marxist who's bent on overthrowing the constitutional order of the United States, obviously you can't do business with him. You have to fight him with every tool you've got. But you don't believe that. I don't believe that. I suspect very few of your colleagues at National Review, if any, believe that. And yet it's said and made an operational reality.
Well, look, I don't think he's a Marxist. I do think he is probably in the by temperament and conviction pretty close to a democratic socialist of the.
Wait, so you think he's a socialist?
Of the mainstream European variety? Yeah, I probably do think that. I mean, I do think.
What do you mean of the mainstream European variety?
Look, the Labour Party is ostensibly a socialist party, right? Do
you think Tony Blair is a socialist?
Tony Blair said he was a socialist. Tony Blair never refuted socialism. It depends what you mean by socialism.
Do you think, by whatever you mean by the word socialist, a command economy, government in control of industry, I don't know what you mean, whatever you mean by it, do you think Tony Blair is a socialist?
I take him at his word when he calls himself a socialist that he's a socialist.
That's sort of lawyerly.
Well, no, yeah. Look, okay, so the higher road.
When you say socialist, what do you think that means?
Well, I actually have the cover story in the latest issue of Commentary dealing with this question.
Yes, I know. But just explain.
I do not think he's a Marxist. I do not think that he has a dialectical, cold materialist interpretation of history. Do I think that his political preferences about the organization of society would fit quite nicely into the Social Democratic Party of Germany? Yeah, I think they would. Where markets are these things to be regulated sort of along a utility model, high degrees of corporatism, the idea that when Barack Obama says that the defining principle of government should be this notion that we are our brother's keeper, that harkens back to a sort of bedrock progressive notion of economic organization and the role of the state. And I think that one of the problems that we have is that too many people equate socialism with Marxism. Marxism is a subset of socialism. Socialism is not a requirement. Is not a subset of Marxism. And what bothers me, not to get too deep into this article, but it seems to me that if John Judas and Harold Meyerson and Matt Iglesias and a lot of these guys can, with nuance and intellectual seriousness, describe Barack Obama's agenda and his policies as socialist, it seems to me that it should be allowed for conservatives to take them at their word for it and talk about it in those terms as well.
So, but that's a rhetorical and a debating strategy, but it's not an analytic category. You have to start when I ask you the question, is somebody a socialist?
Yeah.
You have to have in your own mind, in order to answer that question, you have to have in your own mind some definition of what a socialist is. If somebody believes that market should be that market should exist, but subject to regulation that meets the test of cost-benefit, and then his definition of a cost-benefit analysis is different from mine. That guy's not a socialist. I mean, John Maynard Keynes isn't a socialist. Jimmy Carter wasn't a socialist, although he wanted a lot more regulation than you or I would. Richard Nixon, I don't think, was a socialist, although he certainly imposed more regulation than probably any American president ever. It would seem to me that what it means to be a non-socialist is to believe in markets, private property, and decentralized economic decision-making. Right? I mean, those would be the kinds of things we'd be talking about. And I think what happens, and I think you're demonstrating something that is one of the things I'm concerned about. I don't think you really think that President Obama is a socialist, but actually, but you are constrained here because that right, because to say well, I think he's spending too much money, and I think he's taking on too much debt, and I think some of his specific ideas are overburdensome on private industry. That's just not exciting enough anymore.
No, look, I'm trying to deflate the radioactive. I'm trying to siphon off the poisonous and radioactive level of the word socialist.
Was Richard Nixon a socialist?
He certainly. He was sort of a corporatist. Look, I think there were socialistic elements of certainly wages and price controls and whatnot.
Was Richard Nixon more or less socialistic than Barack Obama?
I would have to say less.
A president who imposed 2 wage and price freezes.
Hey, look, I'm not burning with desire to defend Richard Nixon. But my point is,
I'm not burning with desire to criticism. I'm just I just want to get a sense of I think we're demonstrating something that is important to this discussion will happen, which is I think it's possible to oppose Barack Obama, and I voted against him. I will vote against him again. I would have, if I'd been a member of Congress, I would have voted against the health care plan. I expect I would probably, depending on how exactly it shapes up, vote against the financial reform plan. Certainly would have voted against his budgets. I would have voted against the stimulus. I would have voted for TARP. But I don't think he's a socialist.
That's fine.
I think it's important. But I'll tell you, if you place a call to any conservative talk radio show and say the president's not a socialist, they'll hang up on you, right?
I don't know about that. Look, it seems to me, there's part of this larger debate that a lot of people have been having for a very long time. Paul Krugman is part of it. Charles Murray is part of it. Jim Manzi is part of it. You've been part of it. I've been part of it. Mark Stein has been part of it. There are lots of people who have been talking about how liberal and progressive intellectual elites, of whom I think Barack Obama is sort of the ne plus ultra, right? I mean, he's come straight out of that milieu, have a desire to sort of Europeanize the American social policy, to make us more like Europe. I don't think that is a radical or dangerous or irresponsible observation to make. I think it is well within the mainstream of political discourse. So we look at what Europe is today, and if Europeans, I mean, you may say it's lawyerly or a rhetorical debating point, but I take it kind of seriously. If mainstream European politicians are perfectly happy in describing themselves as socialists, as Tony Blair does, as Gordon Brown does, it seems to me that since that is the European model is the one that we are sort of talking about, it is fine to use those terms. What is the problem is that in the American context, you have this Cold War holdover, where when people hear socialist, they flip the safeties on their rifles and they think Marxist, they think Stalinist, and all those things. And I don't think he is any of those things. But if we're going to have words that we can use, I have no problem. John Judas wants to call it liberal socialism. That works for me too. I don't really care.
You're saying the president's a socialist, but that's not a bad thing.
It's not an evil thing. It's a bad thing. I mean, it's a bad thing in the same way that you think it's a bad thing. I think Barack Obama's agenda is a bad thing in the sense that it is wrong. I don't think it is evil. I don't think it is antithetical to democracy. I don't think it is leading to rounding people up and putting them in camps or anything like that.
Do you think that the American constitutional order is in jeopardy right now?
No. Well, let me put it this way. I don't like. I think the threats to the American constitutional order that have been proceeding apace in many ways for quite a long time, that predate Barack Obama and predate George Bush, and have to do with the post-New Deal constitutional order. Those problems that I do not like are accelerating and getting worse under Barack Obama. But do I think that we have a crisis of the republic, or in the first things sense, a crisis of the regime? No, I don't.
And yet, a lot of people, you'll acknowledge that a lot of people in the conservative talk complex say so.
Yeah, no, I think they do say so, and I don't think.
And they have an enormous audience.
Yes, sure.
Much bigger than you and me. Bigger even than you, and certainly bigger than me.
Yes, sure. Stipulated. Okay.
So we've got people who are very important in the conservative world who are saying things about the president that you think are really not true.
Yes, I think that's right. And I've said that I don't think
is that a problem?
Yeah, it's a problem. It's also well within the confines of political debate and discourse has been going on in this country for 100 years. Right? I mean, people have been saying.
So you think are you saying it's a problem? So you're saying it's a problem, but it doesn't have negative. If the most important conservatives in America, the most visible, the most listened to, are telling people that the president is a Marxist, he's a threat to the constitutional order, you say that's not true, but it's a problem, but it's not a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, essentially. I mean, we're getting lawyerly now on both sides.
Here's why it's important. Now you're a Republican senator, kind of a vulnerable Republican senator. I don't know. I won't name names. You're a vulnerable Republican senator. Doesn't have a completely firm grip on your nomination chances. I mean, it has real consequences for you, right? If Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin and Sean Hannity are saying the president's a Marxist, he's trying to overthrow the republic, he's attacking the constitutional order, you have to be, Frum and Jonah Goldberg say, don't worry about it, none of those things are true, but it affects your behavior, doesn't it?
Sure. Okay.
If Rush Limbaugh, okay, now, and you say that's not true, and you say it's a problem, I mean, you're sort of agreeing that that's the essence of, I think, a lot of what worries me about what has been going on in the conservative world. And you think I'm right.
Well, look, do I think the rhetoric is overheated towards Barack Obama? Yeah. Do I think the rhetoric is overheated towards George Bush? Yeah. Do I think the rhetoric was overheated towards Bill Clinton? Absolutely. Do I think the rhetoric was overheated towards Bush the First, towards Ronald Reagan, towards Richard Nixon? I don't know what they said about Gerald Ford. Yeah, I mean, but American rhetoric gets overheated.
It's not just a matter of name calling, because I agree with you. Some of the things that were said about George Bush, especially toward the end, were horrifying.
Yeah.
And they make my blood boil. I have very ambivalent feelings about a lot of the man's legacy, but I can get really angry about that. But it's also true that Democrats were nonetheless able to vote for the Bush tax cuts. They were able to vote for No Child Left Behind. They were able to vote for the Iraq War, which is something they should never be allowed to forget they did. They were able to vote for all of his defense budgets. That George Bush was able to hold together a working coalition in the House and Senate, despite the awful things that some novelists and university professors said. But that's not true on our side. Our people can look at a program like TARP that many of them voted for when George Bush proposed it, that I think a lot of people in the Senate and the House would quietly say, maybe not in the House, but certainly in the Senate, would say it was necessary, may have saved the world from the Great Depression. And yet they're constrained, they're trapped. They can't do what they think is right because they are trapped by a rhetoric that's not, maybe it isn't any more overheated than usual, although I think it's sort of more noisy, but is more constraining and effective and powerful.
I'm just not sure I am all that persuaded by it. I mean, I think that you had a Republican caucus that came in, and I talked to a lot of guys on the Hill back then, right, who were terrified that they were going to get. I shouldn't say terrified in the sense of the actual legislators, but the handlers and the political consultants were terrified that Barack Obama was actually going to be the moderate centrist that he campaigned on and give the Republicans something like a half a loaf on the stimulus bill, right? I mean, I think that the original sin of the Obama administration in many ways was the stimulus bill. It wasn't the bailouts, it wasn't TARP, it was that. And instead, he went for broke, became a captive of the left wing of the Democratic Party, of Nancy Pelosi and the old bulls who run the committees. And I think Jay Koss makes a very good point that one of the things that drives the Democratic Party these days is the fact that, contrary to the 1960s, the Democratic committee chairs are actually far to the left of the average of the Democratic caucus, let alone the average American. And they got their wish list in that stimulus bill, and it unified the Republican Party into a party of no because they felt that Barack Obama wasn't the guy that they were going to be able to deal with. And the idea that somehow it's I just don't buy that it's talk radio's fault that the Republicans responded the way they did to Barack Obama's agenda. I mean, I'm sure it's true at the margins. I'm sure you can find examples of it. But the idea that the Fox News talk machine created all of this, I don't think is true. And it gets back to the point I was making before when you say that, you can't have it both ways, that the Republican Party is locked into these fundamental bedrock sort of programming from the 70s and 80s about, conservative social policy and all the rest. And at the same time, the Bush administration, which had to deal with Fox News and all the rest too, didn't feel itself constrained by that same monolithic block, except in the cases of immigration reform and Harriet Miers, and that's about it, right? I mean, if Fox News and this talk machine were so locked into this doctrinaire conservatism, Bush would have had to have caved to it too, because he needed Fox News and conservatives a hell of a lot more than Barack Obama did.
Yeah. Well, George Bush always had a strong sense of himself as being more powerful than any of those people, and he was probably right about that. But no Republican senator feels himself to be more powerful than those people, and they're probably right about that too. To take on a sitting Republican president, that's one thing. To take on a sitting Republican senator, very different. I think you make an interesting point, and probably true about the impact of the stimulus. The stimulus was a shocking business. You produced this blackboard demonstration of the need for some kind of Keynesian fiscal action because monetary policy has exceeded itself, and people say, okay, you may be right about that, and they say, good, now we're going to take out of the drawer every lousy program that every Democratic ward healer has imagined since 1968, and we're going to do that. And, well, wait a moment, I thought we were doing something for the good of the national economy, and now you're pulling out all of these pet projects that are not going to end when the recession ends.
Right, and most of that funding doesn't even kick in until the administration was predicting 3.5% growth. Right, so it was timed to kick in for the 9 months before November 2010. I think that was their deadline. I think yes, if I were, you can see why if you're a Republican member of the House and Senate, you'd be pretty shocked by that, and it would disillusion you a little bit. That said, then the president opens up this healthcare discussion, and the United States, if you're a Republican and you think about these things, that we didn't used to be such defenders of the system back when it was costing 14% of GDP. Now it's costing 17%. Now the government is spending 51 cents out of every healthcare dollar in the country. The system is more and more dysfunctional. It's threatening the defense budget. It's threatening the prospects for future tax cuts. And the president comes up with proposals. A lot of elements that one doesn't like, but whose basic DNA is what Mitt Romney did in Massachusetts, and before that what Heritage drafted in 1990 and 91 and became the Republican alternative in 1993 and 94. And again, we had this huge industry that tried to persuade people this was Marxism, that this was worse, it was Nazism, that it was going to lead to the murder of Sarah Palin's children. That was something that, and a lot of very smart people on our side published articles saying, Sarah Palin has, makes a point. There's some validity to this. And I think, you could probably construct her words in a way where
They didn't look as glaringly untrue as they did when they proceeded from her mouth. But didn't that also create a situation where we couldn't enter any Republican ideas into this bill? We couldn't say, let's not, if we proposed subsidies ourselves in the past, but we don't want to finance the taxes on work and saving. We dealt ourselves out of the game, and we both know that there were a lot of senators who would have liked to have been in that game.
Yeah, okay, but so if you think that the sum total of the healthcare bill was bad, right, and if you think that if you make the calculation, which seems to me not entirely unreasonable, that anything that the Republicans could have gotten out of these negotiations, I mean, a lot of your argument boils down to this idea that the Republicans could have gotten some great concessions out of this healthcare bill, and I am, it's particularly after the stimulus, and with Pelosi and Reid running the thing, I'm wholly unpersuaded by that possibility, at least from the people that I trust and talk to about this stuff. But let's get back to the talk radio thing for a second. So let's stipulate that your position is right, that to this extent, that the talk radio guys say a lot of things, have a lot of overheated rhetoric. They talk, they put things in too stark terms. They constrain people too much. And so your response to this is to have a frontal assault on all of these guys, to deride them, to say that, to argue that they are making their cases in bad faith, that, they are invested in this conservative talk industry, and that's why they're saying these things and all of the rest. And it seems to me, I remember, it's funny, I remember you were the first one to point this out to me, and I've never actually found the quote, where Bill Buckley had once said that the point of bringing in all of those Wallace voters, all of those sort of Southern Democrat voters into the conservative fold wasn't so that conservatives would buy their racist and bad ideas, but rather that we would have a mass conversion where we would convert them to our ideas.
Yeah.
Now,
yes,
I'm sorry?
That's from his Playboy interview in 1970.
Well, we can talk about that off air, but I looked for it in the Playboy thing. I could not find it, and maybe I'll look again, but it's been a while.
Okay.
Anyway, but it sounds like Bill. It's not. Anyway, your approach is to put not too fine a point on it, anathematize these people and say that they are illegitimate, and that even though you agree with them probably on 5 of 10 issues, let's say 5.5 out of 10 issues, your approach instead is to say that their entire project is baleful and damaging to the conservative movement, and that these people should be shunned. Now, as a purely,
I've never said anything like that. It'd be absurd for me to anathematize Rush Limbaugh. That'd be ridiculous, right? That would be like he's the most powerful conservative in America. So, and I'm not such a fool that I don't know that. What I said in my Newsweek article was not. I certainly didn't say he should be shunned. What I pointed out in that Newsweek article was that he was doing real harm, and that was not to tell him what to do. It was to try to create a base for a bigger kind of conservatism. Back when we all came in, Rush Limbaugh's been on the air since 1986. He was a part of the whole, but he was not what he is today. And partly because other conservative institutions have gotten weaker. I don't know that he's necessarily stronger, but other institutions are weaker. But I didn't anathematize him. I didn't call him people shun him. I said, here is the harm he is doing. And I made that case, and I think that case has been proven right, as we've seen over the past 2 years in Congress, that he made it impossible for Republicans to do business in a way that legislators in the minority normally do business. And you don't disagree with me about that.
No, I'm not sure I don't disagree with you about that. As I said, I don't think that he or the larger conservative industrial complex is responsible for Republicans in the House and the Senate becoming the party of no. And it seems to me, I have no huge problem with them being the party of no for the foreseeable future. At some point, you have to change strategies and become the party of something else. But during the first year of the Obama administration, it seemed to me that it was a wholly defensible proposition to be the party of no, given what Barack Obama wanted to do.
Okay. Look, and your friend Glenn Beck, and I know you're close, so I'm not going to ask you to say anything about him one way or the other. But he goes beyond Limbaugh. He goes beyond Levin. I mean, he doesn't just call the president a Marxist. He suggests he's a Maoist, and that someone who is in his government who made borrowed a Lee Atwater joke about Chairman Mao, which is maybe not the most tasteful joke in the world. I'm back from China, and I'm sensitive to that. That means that the administration is overrun by actual literal Maoists who want to put Americans into blue suits, and that he shares ideas with the Nazis, and he is engaged in this massive attack on the constitutional order of the United States, and 2 million people a day watch that and absorb, and I presume are influenced by it. I mean, I'll concede to you, Jonah. I worry about this all the time. That I may not be having a pot that that conservatives are not going to respond well to the way I'm putting it. I worry all the time, and like everybody, I have a temper, and sometimes in the heat of debate, lose it. But of all the problems in the conservative world right now, the fact that I sometimes talk about Glenn Beck's statements, overstatements, hysterical overstatements, in a way that is harsher than people who like Glenn Beck might like, as compared to those statements themselves and their impact on our politics. That seems to me, problem number 97.
Well, I mean, just as a point of personal privilege, I think that your point about comparing, of overplaying the Maoist thing, I mean, and your concern about comparisons to the Chinese, it probably wasn't your best moment the other day when you compared National Review, saying that National Review reminded you of the China you just returned from, particularly when you were making the case that no one at National Review got Jim Manzi's back on this stupid corner fight, when in fact I had defended Jim Manzi. Regardless, on the larger point of Glenn Beck.
Well, yes and no. And I think that Jim was, and that Jim was entitled to feel. I mean, he has a lot of. I mean, the Manzi thing. This is maybe very inside baseball. But I think. I mean, I haven't spoken to him about this. I mean, you and he are probably much closer than he and I are. But it was a pretty harsh moment. And a colleague, I think he's still a member of the board of trustees of National Review, right? I mean, he got this kind of this kind of beating, and from his colleagues, and it was awfully quiet. Didn't it seem that way?
Well, your post went up, and this is really inside baseball. Your post went up saying that nobody in the corner came to Manzi's defense 3 hours after I had come to the guy's defense. And I think part of the problem is Jim has got a real tone-deaf thing about some of these things as well, is that he used this silly epistemic closure argument and a post by Ross Douthat as this opportunity to beat up on another colleague. I mean, as much as Mark Levin has no right to complain about people going for the jugular, let's say, Jim comes out of the blue to attack a 1.5-year-old book for its discussion.
Has anybody at the corner ever criticized Mark Levin for the way he talks about people?
I don't know. I mean, it's entirely possible.
I don't have it at my finger. Okay, I don't have it at my fingertips either. But if Jim Manzi's tone is so objectionable that he's to be wailed on in that way, and Mark Levin is also a colleague, and he also has a tone, I would be interested to know whether when Levin on-site and off-site speaks in the way that he does, and he is a very vituperative voice, whether there's anyone at National Review who has ever said anything remotely like what was said about Jim Manzi. That would be curious.
Yeah, I'd be curious too. I mean, but look, my point is that Jim starts this broadside. No one is shocked when Mark Levin comes back barrels blazing, and I think that Catherine and Andy McCarthy's responses were too knee-jerk in defense of their friend, and but I thought Manzi's decision to do what he did was ill-considered as well. And then we got on this because your discussion of National Review, says, it reminds you of China, which is, what you're indicting Glenn Beck for doing. And I just say, I was just a point of personal privilege on this. I'd also say that,
all right, you know what? Let me stop you there, and let me apologize for that.
Okay, fine.
I was making a joke. You're right. It was in bad taste. I shouldn't have done it.
Look,
and I want to grovel a little bit more because National Review is a very important part of my life, and I really treasure a lot of the people there. So if that gave offense, I apologize. It was inappropriate. I shouldn't have said.
That's appreciated. My only point is that if you're going to make a huge deal about tone and language, you should adhere to your own strictures about it.
You're right.
For myself, I am much more of a let things fly. I mean, I'm much less than I was in the old days. I've become much more temperate and diplomatic and polite in a lot of these arguments than I would have been 10 years ago. But I still think, in terms of the American political discourse, the rhetoric that we have out there, and this reminds me, rather than getting into all that, this reminds me of a point that I wanted to make about a more general point, which is that, a lot of what you're pointing at, I think what you're doing is you are looking at the symptoms rather than the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is that this country is radically polarized, right? It is still a 50-50 country, essentially.
No, it's not. No, it's really not. That actually, and this is, I realize that we're almost out of time and we've neglected this. I don't think that's right. I think that we are moving to a point where the ideals I believe in, that you believe in, are supported by a dwindling and aging population, and that we're not seeking, we're not talking to the country as it is and as it's going to be.
Okay, well, rather than, we can get into a wonky argument about how polarized it is, whether it's 50-50, but instead, in the time remaining, let's get to, back to the original point that I was making, which is the way you're going about trying to make your points, right? And the way you're trying to go about persuading people to all this kind of stuff. I assume you're still opposed to gay marriage, right?
I'm making my peace with it. I think it's the future. I think it's going to happen. I think we have to have confidence in our fellow citizens that they're going to make a success out of it, and that we're going to have to address, and that you and I on the conservative side are going to have to address the things that we're most concerned about, which is the instability of the American family and what it means for the life chances of children who grow up without two biological parents. We're going to have to address that problem in some other way.
Okay, so you're actually coming around to essentially the position I had 7 years ago. That's fine.
Maybe so. You may have been a little ahead of my time.
And so I was reading something you wrote explaining your position, where you said that, when you were growing up in the conservative movement, it seemed that the conservatives were the ones who were speaking to the common sense of the American people against the meddling and the scheming of an out-of-touch elite. I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's sort of it. And it seems to me like one of your great issues is fighting obesity, right? And
well, I wouldn't call it a great issue, but it's important because I think it goes to the whole question of healthcare outcomes and healthcare costs.
Okay, so I don't dispute that at all. I think it is an important public health issue and all of the rest. And it comes up quite a bit from what I can tell at the Frum Forum. At the same time, that sort of nanny statism, right? I don't think, forgive me if that sounds like too much rhetoric, but there is a nanny statism out there, right? That sort of nanny statism does run very elitist, right? Most Americans, when you start telling them, you can tell them they have to pay more taxes or they have to get health insurance, but when you tell them they can't have a Big Mac, or that, as they're doing in California right now, that they're banning Happy Meals, that sounds like
toys with Happy Meals.
Right. Okay. Which, if you talk to my daughter, would be banning Happy Meals. But so you are talking about a government that is trying to get deeply involved in the common man's life in a way that I think a lot of Americans do not like, and it seems to me that in many ways, the way you're coming across here is I'm all in favor. If you want to be deeply involved in the weeds of social and economic and health policy and all of the rest, and you think you have the best practices and you think the government should adopt them and all of the rest, that's fine. But that mindset in many ways will come across to the common person as exactly the same sort of elites meddling in people's lives.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you and I are inescapably members of an elite by the very fact that we do what we do, and that means we have privileges, we have responsibilities. And I think the tendency to forswear identification of an elite status, and that is not the same thing as enormous wealth, which I don't think we have, but we have more privilege, more buffer. We have more access to the media. We have more access to public opinion. We have more access to information.
Sure. Okay.
That puts us in an elite position. And I don't. And if we're going to worry about the costs of government, and I want to worry about the cost of government in a way that actually makes an impact on the cost of government. I mean, how often do we hear a Republican politician say that the problem is the debt, the problem is the cost of government, the problem is high taxes? And then you say, well, what are you going to do about this? They'll say, we have to put our arms around entitlements. And I say, okay, you got your arm around the entitlements. Now, what are you going to do? And this past summer, we saw Republicans say that Medicare can never be touched. You say that to worry about America's largest public health problem, cause of $1.10. I mean, was it nanny statism when we worried about smoking and about seatbelts? Those things also are important drivers. The United States spends 60% more than any other industrial country on health, which is, by the way, if the United States spent as much on health as Switzerland, it would be like getting the entire defense budget for free and having 2 points of GDP left over for private consumption. And we can't. And actually, Americans don't have better health outcomes. Americans don't live as long as people in other industrial countries, and obesity is a big part of the problem. So it's a government spending issue, and.
But it is. But you asked the question about seatbelts and smoking, and it is nanny statism. Sure, look, nannies do all sorts of things for kids that kids need to be, need, but it doesn't mean they're not nannies. And I don't think. First of all, I thought that.
Do you oppose seatbelt laws?
I have to think about it.
Do you oppose motorcycle helmet laws?
As long as they're imposed at the state level as they are, it doesn't really bother me that much. No, I mean, I don't like motorcycles. Motorcycles are terrible things, but
What about the Consumer Product Safety Commission that regulates the flammability of mattresses and pajamas and things like that?
I think that's fine.
Nanny statism?
I think that's fine. It may be nanny statism. I mean, it's sort of like the socialism point I was trying to make earlier. Just because it's nanny statism and just because it's socialism doesn't mean it's bad per se or indefensible, but it does mean it requires a higher level of scrutiny from conservatives who work from a first principle that, I disagree with libertarians on a lot of things, but I don't think there is any, and this goes back to your original, to dead right? I disagree with libertarians on all sorts of things, but I don't think any room of policymakers should be bereft of at least one or two libertarians who are willing to ask the question, why should government do anything at all?
Yeah, for sure. Well, for anything. But why should government do this?
That's what I mean. Right. I mean, we're talking about
No, that's right. I mean, I think there's the question, why should government regulate seatbelts? That's a great question. And that's part that you start there. And then I think that's a pretty easy question to answer. Because we know that if government doesn't regulate, we know when government didn't regulate it, I'm not going to remember the number, but something like 70% of motorists wore seatbelts, and now the government does, more than 90% of motorists do, and we can probably quantify the number of lives saved, and the intrusion on liberty doesn't seem so terribly burdensome, and so that you proceed through that argument. But this is a whole style of politics and thought. This is exactly the style I'm recommending to conservatives. I think it leads to very conservative outcomes, but it's the one that is rejected by the first principles approach that dominates the airwaves. And, we're coming to the end of our time, and this would be a great conversation to continue, because I think we're getting to. I mean, if you're saying to me, David, you're not doing a very good job of bringing conservatives along with you, I have to say, Jonah, you're right. I worry about it all the time. And sometimes I tell myself that it's a matter of passage of time. Sometimes I think maybe what I'm going to do is set an example for somebody who will do the same thing, only better, and they will be more influential. And some days, I just say, I got a bad temper sometimes, and I lose it, and I shouldn't have lost it under those circumstances. That's all right. I'll concede all of that, and probably, well, not probably, but I know I wouldn't say again if given a second chance. That said, you've agreed with me through this that the dominant tone in the conservative world, which is not set by me, is untrue, is constraining, has real-world consequences, and yet that seems to be not something that very many people other than me are willing to speak up against. So do it. Why don't you take my job and do it better?
Well, look, one thing, you keep using this phrasing of that I've conceded that all these things are untrue. Some of the things are absolutely untrue, and I've said them before. But a lot of the things fall under the rubric of exaggerations and hyperbole, right? And you can, and it's an important point that people forget about exaggerations is that you can only exaggerate the truth. You can't exaggerate.
Do you worry, Jonah, when you say that the president's a socialist, or the socialist tradition, or participates in the socialist tradition, but that's okay. Do you worry that what you're doing is decontaminating socialism, and that you're becoming the David Cameron of socialism and making it legitimate again? I mean, don't you think it was an important conservative achievement for them to say, here's what socialism is, and it's out, and nobody should be one. And if you are one, that's a really bad thing. And then you're saying, well, actually, if you're in favor of a little bit of excessive federal spending and kind of Obama-style, sloppy stimulus, that's socialism. Don't you think? I don't know if that was there was a Gallup poll that came out at the beginning of the Obama administration about how young people were more comfortable with the term socialism. I don't know if that was a blip or a real poll. But do you think maybe that the overuse of it and the identification of socialism with things that people like could actually backfire? I mean, if non-flammable children's pajamas are socialism, then I guess we're all socialists.
Well, that's actually one of the. It was a Rasmussen poll, and it was one that a lot of liberals, both Harold Morrison and John Judas both call themselves socialists in one way or another.
I don't know whether it was a good poll or not.
Yeah, I don't know that it was a good poll or not. I mean, it certainly was seized on by a lot of people. No, look, I mean, first of all, I don't think about it, and maybe this is, a mistake on my part. I don't think about it in those tactical terms. What, and some of this comes out of my book, is I think that, there is since we're going to talk tactically, there is a real disadvantage that conservatives have, which is that, we are constantly being accused of, you hear this, talk about cycles. Every time a Republican leaves office, every time a Republican's in office, he's a rehash of Herbert Hoover, right? And even Herbert Hoover wasn't Herbert Hoover. But, we've now heard about how George Bush was a champion of market fundamentalism and radical laissez-faire, and Obama does this all of the time. And I think you would agree that the idea that the guy who signed into law Sarbanes-Oxley and passed, the prescription drug benefit was not a market fundamentalist in any real sense. And so we are constantly being asked to claim that we are laissez-faire, and meanwhile, liberals get to claim that they are these pragmatists, that they are working within the 40-yard lines of American political discourse and all of the rest. And meanwhile, they are pursuing an incrementalism that fits well within the sort of progressive agenda that would be recognized as socialism. Maybe not, it's not Marxism and not communism, but mainstream democratic socialism would be recognized as such throughout most of Europe. And it seems to me that there is a paucity of acceptable vocabulary to sort of clarify these arguments. And I find it annoying that when conservatives use language that, conservatives are constantly being asked to use the language that liberals say is okay. And when conservatives try to clarify these issues using often language that liberals themselves use in their own conversations and their own policy journals, we are all of a sudden claimed to not understand the nuances of all of these things. And that's why I think there should be a deflation of some of these terms so that we can actually talk about them.
We've been here for more than an hour, and we've probably lost the entire audience.
Probably.
Let me just say, and I know you have things to do, but let me just end with one final thought, and I'll give you the last word of the talking stick. I think conservatives deny their greatest achievement, if they fail to see that the United States, even in 2010, is a country that is not only more free market in practice, but more free market in the commitments of almost all of its leading politicians than the United States of 1970. And we have made enormous progress. The economy is freer, it's more dynamic, it's less regulated, the government's ambitions are more modest. And my strong sense would be that, I don't know what's inside the president's head, but he at least is operating within something that looks, very much like the Keynesian liberal capitalism. It looks like somebody who has accepted the deregulation revolution of the 1970s, that we may have some arguments of the exact regulation of finance, but President Obama is not proposing, for example, to reimpose the federal regulation of the interest paid on checking accounts, which was the law of the land until 1975.
Okay, well, it's an interesting argument, and it's a tough one to go into at 1 hour and 5 minutes in. But I would say that your faith in the ambitions of the Obama administration is greater than mine. I mean, the fact that we have now essentially nationalized student loans in this country, that we have decided that they were
nationalized before. We're just changing who's handling them. We've always had government. The government issued the loans. It was just the banks processed them.
We can argue about student loans if you want, but on issue after issue, the presumption is that the government's role in American life, according to Obama, should be expanded. That from putting strings attached to student loans, if you go into work for government, the idea that they floated, I don't know where it stands right now, that if you have a contract with the federal government, you have to be paid, you have to pay your workers more, and all of the rest. This whole metastasizing problem with public sector unions. My complete lack of trust with Obama, the idea that he really wants to get out of the auto industry, the idea that we're going to basically we've turned the health insurance companies into utilities, and it looks like we're going to be they want to head that way with Wall Street. I agree with you that we have made enormous progress since the 1970s, back when the Republican Party was still essentially a liberal party too. But I am less confident that we have secured those victories than you are, and I am less confident in Barack Obama's desire to leave those victories untouched. I take him at his word when he sees himself as the sort of liberal Ronald Reagan.
I don't think we've secured them. I think they're in danger, and that's why I think we need to be wise as well as strong.
Okay,
Jonah, it's a delight to talk. It's a delight to talk to you, and thank you. I know you had a busy afternoon,
sure,
and let's resume this at some future time.
Sure, sounds good. Thanks, David.
Bye bye.